actually were a state, it would rank 49th in population behind Vermont and Wyoming, and 31st in area, be the smallest. It's number 1 by GDP per capita. Would be the highest GDP of any state, and 34 by total GP. So there would be.
I don't know what you just said. I don't know what that means. Okay.
Okay, GDP, gross domestic product. I mean, how much stuff happens? How much money goes around? Right. The people who live in DC would have the highest dollar volume per person being moved in the economy, and it would be 34 on the rank. So there would be actually 70 other states that have a lower total economy, smaller economy than DC. So 1 by average income per person, average household income, and 34 by total GDP. So it's not an insignificant area. Now, there was a 2016 statehood referendum where the mayor proposed a vote, and it was done in the district, and it said, "Do you want to be a state?" And the answer was, 86% said yes, and 14% said no. So it was overwhelming. People said we want to be a state. They also, by the way, said something else. It's been proposed saying, well, District of Columbia, so we call it the state of New Columbia. But what actually happened is the people's proposed that the name be changed to the State of Washington, D.C., where D.C. stood for Douglas Commonwealth, named after the abolitionist Frederick Douglass, that lived in D.C. in 1877 to 1895. Wow. Right? So they want to have Douglas Commonwealth, Washington, State of Washington, Douglas Commonwealth would be the formal name of the state. There's been votes that have tried to pass in the House and Senate. There was a non-binding vote. That's one of the ways you can do in Congress, where you say, well, let's have a non-binding vote. People get a little less irritated, and they're more likely that something slide. And so 2019, they had an HR 1, which said non-binding support for a state, and that passed a lot. So recently, the George Floyd protests talked about, and people said, Trump's controversial use of the DC National Guard, among other forces, against peaceful protesters, said, if this was a state, we would have a state National Guard, and we'd have state representatives who would be answerable to us. We wouldn't have these other folks handling around the state. Because remember, DC is not just the capital mall, it's the surrounding area. So there was, on the most recent bill, as Nicholas pointed out, was that passed the House, essentially said, it passed, it said essentially, well, we'll allow DC to become a state, and inside DC will be this very small capital district that basically is the Capitol Mall. It would include from the Lincoln Memorial, the Supreme Court building, the White House, the Capitol itself. That would become that small section there, the Capitol Mall, where people don't really reside, would become the Capitol District.
That's what I would think.
Yeah, and there you could say, there may be technically a couple of people who are residing that live in. I think there's some couple of people that are caretakers that live in like the national, the Smithsonian place. There's a couple of people that might live in there, but effectively there'd be almost nobody other than the president and vice president that would live in that area.
Well, and that's interesting because there's, again, you would assume that the people who lived there originally were only the people that would work in that environment, and so they would be representing themselves as well as whoever they represent in the United States.
Sure.
And so that's what's interesting about that, is that as you expand the territory to include all of these places where people are actually living in modern times, that's where it's becoming an issue, because those people might not be working within the government, but it makes sense that you would reserve the people who are actually making the choices in the legislation, that they're like, of course they're going to express their individual interests as themselves while expressing the interests of the people they represent.
Sure, and it'd be not unlike states have federal buildings inside them, right? And you go down and you might see a federal building where the government has a particular, institution and spot. The DC state, Washington, the state of Washington, Douglas Commonwealth would have inside it a little capital district, which would be potentially owned by there. So one of the objections is, well, could you do it constitutionally? And so the way they get around it is the argument saying, well, we would just shrink the capital that is governed under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 to being just the Capitol Mall, just the Capitol. And then the state of Washington, of Washington, Douglas Commonwealth would then be a state. They'd have 2 senators and initially a member of Congress or House of Representatives. The next census would come along. They'd figure out, based upon the census, the population, how many representatives they have. But initially, they'd start with 3.
So I have one more question, though.
Sure, please.
Is there a benefit to the citizens of not establishing it as a state? Because, I know that in certain parts of the U.S., like in Vegas, there are things that the citizens can do that they can't do in other places. Like they can drink on the street and stuff because they're technically part of something other than the state of Nevada. So it's interesting that I wonder if there's like a part of their existence there that is preventing them from wanting to become a state.
Well, places like Las Vegas or New Orleans are part of the state. They're governed the state. The state can make laws that give special status to certain districts. But
there's a certain thing that there's rules that apply to the Bellagio and that area in terms of public drinking and things that don't apply to the rest of Nevada.
That's because the state of Nevada, seeing that as in their economic best interest, created that. Just like the state of Louisiana created special districts in New Orleans for that same reason, right? The state could do that.
Right.
It's still part of the state and governed by the state rules. It's just the state.
Well, and that's what I meant is that they've made some sort of difference in the way that they govern that area for the certain purpose of what they're doing.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious if there's something like that, like if there's something the citizens of DC are allowed to do, or if there's some benefit to them of not becoming a state.
Well, some people might think that because Congress tends to do nothing, that the laws of DC tend to be fairly static, right? It's very difficult to have Congress to pay attention to the district, particularly because all those members of Congress are interested in the district and state that they're from. So some people who may want to say, I don't want government to do anything, like the fact that Congress is really unable to govern its district.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk about the arguments against it, because
let me interrupt real quick. Just 2 public service announcements. First of all, in case I forget, and I will try to remind people at the end, we are going to continue this in the Discord once we're done. Anyone who wants to join us, I'll be there. Landon will be there. Anyone who wants to come join us in the Discord, we'll have this discussion. Also, we have changed streams. We had the internet cut out briefly. So I was able to restore the connection. It had to be done through a second stream, but we have changed the rooms. A number of the audience has already moved into the other room, and we will merge the files into a single one at some other point. But in the interim, I do apologize for it's just we lost internet, and I was able to we reconnected to a new stream once the internet was restored. We were out for about a minute and a half, but we are back, and everything is going again. But for those of you who see that the stream has been canceled, we are now in part 2 room, and everything is continuing, and most of the people are in there now. But please continue. So you were going to say disadvantages.
So let's be fair. Let's talk about the arguments against statehood. I mean, the actual district, prior to the founding, Madison basically said that, he said, quote, but dependence of matters of the general government on a state comprehending the seat of government and for the protection and exercise of their duty might bring national councils and into imitation of awe and influence equally dishonorable to the government and dissatisfactory to the members of the Confederacy. That being the Articles of Federation. What he basically was saying was, hey, if the capital were part of a state, that state would have undue influence. So there's been arguments, and one of the processes is something called retrocession. Remember, Maryland ceded part of it, and also for Virginia at that time as well. Maryland ceded part of its land to the capital. And so one of the proposals is, well, give it back to Maryland and let those people be considered, residents of Maryland. And the members of DC overwhelmingly voted no on that. They wanted to be their own state. They didn't want to be beholden to Maryland, which has its own issues and interests. They've also had, another recently opponents to DC Statehood said that the federal government would become dependent upon a single state for its security operations. And except for like law enforcement, like Secret Service, and that state might enact policies inconsistent with how the government runs as a whole. So imagine, for example, if DC were a state and the governor, like the other 50 governors, refused to call the National Guard and crackheads, right? When the president was asking law and order down, the president was able to do things in DC because he was effectively head of the DC National Guard.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Sorry, something stuck in my throat.
But let's be fair. The argument is, well, gee, if DC were a state, even if you took the small capital area as being the capital district inside that state, that state might cause things to happen. For example, would for example, could for example the state impede? Let's say if the District of Columbia said we are under quarantine, and in order to enter the state of basically Douglas Commonwealth, you had to quarantine for 14 days. Even when you have the airport would be outside the capital, but inside DC, would that allow that state to now? The main thing that this notion of, well, the state would have undue influence really, I think, was resolved back in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, when after the Civil War, the federal government asserted its authority in matters that the Constitution permitted to do. So I think this notion that a DC state would be unduly powerful might have been the case back in the Articles of Confederation back in the 1700s, but today it doesn't really hold water, in my opinion. But that argument is made, right? There's also a notion of whether or not granting statehood would need approval of Maryland. Remember, Maryland ceded the area to the government, right? And so, Maryland's consent was not needed when part of Maryland was transferred to DC in 1945. Because there's an island there that had mudflats and so forth. They used to create what's now Reagan National Airport. That was a transfer, and that didn't need Maryland's thing. It essentially was basically there was sort of this pier line that jurisdictionally transferred, allowing the police and the control by Virginia, but remained with Congress.
But the land was essentially on loan, though. The original indefinite, but it was on loan, so it would be essentially takeage by the federal government if they or some sort of eminent domain if they declared it
Yeah.
its own state without Virginia's. I mean, I assume they could actually by eminent domain, but nonetheless, it's takeage.
Well,
And-
I'm also
go ahead.
curious about whether whether they couldn't just make the surrounding area where people live and not anything other than just like the Capitol grounds and everything. If they couldn't just make that the state that DC is a part of, like
Yeah.
extend the borders of that and have it just add a higher population to existing states instead of establishing a brand new one.
Well, and that's called retro. That would be retrocession. And
Right.
the people within DC that have been governing themselves somewhat under Congress say that they're not members of Maryland. They've not been part of Maryland for 230 years, and Maryland is dealing with Maryland stuff, not with their own. So that's their argument. And in fact, you look at the Douglas Commonwealth would be a significant state as far as GDP, and certainly it's more populous than two other states. So their argument is, hey, why should we become that other state? Why not let us have it? Well, now we get to one of the comments that is a little less pretty about this whole thing. The voting population in Washington, D.C. is overwhelmingly Democratic. The numbers are around 80 to 83%, depending on legislation. It's also overwhelmingly African American. There are Republicans that would see if essentially the state of Washington, Douglas Commonwealth, became a state that would give, they claim would give Democrats 2 safe seats in the Senate and 1 or more safe seats in Congress, and would not, they would object to that. There's also the fact that because it would be the first state that's overwhelmingly non-white in its voting popularity, there are people who don't like that. But they couch it in other terms.
That's problematic that people are like, we would rather keep our political power and say, you can't vote if you're not going to vote for us. Like, that's exactly what that is. Like, there's a sense that like, oh, we're just going to keep you from being able to vote. And is it a coincidence geographically that the place where people can't vote is overwhelmingly African American? Is that like a redlining thing?
And
it would not surprise me if that wasn't like a deliberate redlining thing.
Yes, and I mean, the White House was built by slaves, right? So that's just let's
so
call facts, right?
Yeah,
and it's sitting there on the boundary between the former Confederacy and the Union, right? That was also part of this balance stuff between slave states and federal states and so forth. And it was a whole big to do. But there are a number of things that happen in, let's say, the Republican Party, that even though the local Republican Party in DC has been a longstanding supporter of voter rights in District of Columbia, the Republican Party see that as no, because that gives them 2 free senators, right? And if you look at the balance of power, like now, that could tip different. So when Nicholas said, "What do you think are the chances that would happen?" And the current thing is absolutely 0, less than 0%, because McConnell recognizes that the potential control and inability to influence legislation would be diminished if the overwhelmingly Democratic, voters in the state of Douglas were to be given franchise.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. This is so interesting. All right. So this is why it's so relevant now. This is why it's
Yes.
being argued now, because you have a group of people who basically, if they become the other part of a surrounding state, then that could potentially just be like gerrymandered around
Yep.
their political influence. And so what they want is to have their own political influence because they are their own entity who needs to have their own voice in their government.
Yeah.
And that's interesting because like I wonder what the police brutality stats are of that, because like whoa, like,
well, but see, there's the problem is
interesting.
that Congress gave the locally some things, but mostly it becomes when particularly things get tough, it's the National Guard under the president, and it's the Congress that pushes things forward. So, for example, license plates. For a long time, the license plates had a slogan saying "taxation without representation." So, Washington D.C. taxation without representation on the license plate, right?
They're a little rebellion there. Okay, yeah.
And actually, Bill Clinton even had those plates put on the president's limousines.
Oh wow!
Oh,
right? Because it's part of the thing of saying, let's call it like it is, right?
That's interesting.
When George W. Bush came in, one of his first acts as president was to not only remove those plates, but to bar the voter vehicle registration from issuing new plates that said taxation without representation.
Like for anyone or for the president's
for putting it
for anyone.
The state logo, because you get a New Mexico
land
of enchantment, or whatever the state logo is. There is no state slogan.
New Hampshire is live free or die.
Yeah, you got it.
So one of his first, I'm talking about when George W. Bush became president, comes in and signs saying, "This is my chief of staff. This is the I reappoint the joint chief of staff." One of the things was take off those things out the limo and disallow DC to make any more plates of that nature.
Wow.
One of the first acts that
what?
Barack Obama did was to put it back on the limo and let them do that, right?
Well, how was he allowed to do that? How was Bush allowed?
Well, remember, it's not a state, so it's the president has executive power. The president is, if you will, the governor, if you will,
king.
The king, and so he said nope, right? Because remember, if you were a member, a resident of Washington D.C., you have to convince a majority of House representatives and a majority of senators, and hope that you don't get a filibuster to get something like that even considered. Yeah. Right. And you mentioned giving it to Maryland and say, well, Maryland would just reapportion that stuff out there as well. So the part of the act said, let's bootstrap. There's a proposed constitution, state constitution for Washington and the Douglas Commonwealth, and it said that the mayor would become the governor, the city council would become the state assembly, and that they would then hold a vote for the two senators and the member of Congress, and then in the next census would be in 2030, they determine how many members based upon population. That's kind of proposal, but understand it's very likely that some of right now it would probably be 3 or 4 depending upon population, right?
Well, I mean, do DC residents participate in the census now?
Yes, they do.
Interesting.
Right?
I guess there's purposes outside of that.
Well, they're in the census, but they don't have the benefit. They don't get awarded anything, and their numbers don't count in the overall estimation of how based on population.
By the way, for the record, President Trump continued use of the plates. He let them stay on. He stated he had no position regarding statehood, and then some people got to him and said, if you push that, you'll get 2 Democrats as senators, right? And so he then, in 2020, said, DC statehood would never happen.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah.
Oh, I hate politics sometimes.
Well,
So-
and that's why the vote in this vote here, it happened in the House of Representatives, which has a Speaker of the House who sets the agenda. The Speaker of the House is now a Democrat. It's Nancy Pelosi. So she was able to make sure that this came to a vote. This came to a vote. It passed with all Republicans and one Democrat opposed. But since they're a minority, it passed. But every single Republican to a man voted against it. Now the Republicans are in charge of the Senate, so unless at least a few flip, it won't pass the Senate. And Trump has already said he's going to veto it because America.
Require 2/3, right? But you'd have to get it past McConnell.
Exactly,
and
Courtney.
You'd have to overcome. You have to get 60 votes to overcome a filibuster, and so that's why Barack said, when you go back to a Barack statement, he talks about, he said that essentially it is a difficult issue, right? That while he certainly supported it, he said, I'm for it. But he said there's been a long movement to get DC statehood for quite some time, 237 years. No. But politics is ending up making it very difficult to get through Congress. Also, you can be assured that if it were to pass and be signed into law by the president, it would be challenged in the court.
Oh, jeez. Well,
but that's usual thing. But they could probably draft it to say no. The Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 says the district. It doesn't say how big the district is, as long as it's not more than 10 square miles. So the district could be shrunk to just the capital mall.
Yep.
Yeah.
And Congress has the power to.
And then the rest would become its own state.
Declare a state. Yeah.
So now,
that's interesting. Man.
Is the threat of filibuster why it didn't happen? Because it seems to me when the Dems were in charge of both houses and the presidency, which they were for, I believe, 2 years under Obama, why didn't they push it then?
Yeah.
One of the most incompetent leaders of the Senate was in charge of the Senate.
Ooh.
Harry Reid, a utterly competent person. They had 60 votes.
Okay,
they could have rounded through. I mean, what I would do if I became Senate Democratic leader, because opening session of Senate has a rule that says you establish the initial stuff like who's chair and who's the leader and all that sort of stuff, and the rules are established by up or down majority voice vote, no debate.
Yes.
You can put anything one in there, and I would stick right in there DC statehood. I would say I would sit there and say DC statehood is non-debatable.
Because it's already been debated forever. Like that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly.
Like it's a dead debate.
Right?
Sure.
It's done, and so you could say matters of DC statehood are not subject to debate. There's no filibuster. And
I'd be really curious to look into the whole history of why the demographic is that way and the whole redlining question, because that's really interesting. If anybody doesn't know what redlining is in the audience, we can talk about it in another thing. But interesting.
And believe me, there's other little sub things in there, but I've given you sort of the highlights and stuff. We're not talking about Congress being able to go back on their word and so forth. So if you had a case, you see, for example, someone could say, well, Congress could pass a law saying that the observer actually gets to vote. And you'll say, well, I'm not sure that's constitutional. And besides, if it was constitutional, Congress could take it back if they didn't like what that person's doing. Remember, there's nothing that a legislature can do that would prevent a future legislature from undoing it. You can't sit there and say, this is the law, and you can never change it again.
So I understand the fear of having the 2 extra delegates. So what realistic difference would that make? Would that make enough of a difference to have it be a huge, like Republicans would never win again kind of thing? Like that, I don't think that would be the case.
No, if you look at the current polling, the polling suggest that that Congress, the Senate might be headed for a 50-50 split.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, if the election were held today, given the trends, you'd have 50 Republicans and 50 Democrats. And remember, the vice president is the person that casts the deciding vote.
So you count it as 51.
Right.
So it's 50. It would be 51-50, but then if you added 2, it would be 52-51 in essence in terms of voting power. But
now you sit there and say but that means that if you're the opposition party, they've got 50, you got 50. You basically tie the VPs to the chair of the Senate because he's going to stay there all the time to break ties.
Yeah.
And all it takes is one of your members to become dissatisfied, and you've lost it, right? So if you had a majority of 2, reversed, then 52-50 is a whole lot different, right? Than that. Also, understand what happens sometimes is a senator says, "Yeah, party, I agree with this bill, but my people in my state don't like it. So let me vote against it."
Yeah.
So please either find a vote that means my vote isn't necessary and let me vote no, so I can pretend like I pay attention to my people backstage. Right? 2 would give you more of a wiggle room. So someone who is kind of squeamish, they could say, "Yeah, I'm not sure I like that, but I will go along with it. But since you have a majority of 2 or 3 votes, let me be one of the people that votes no."
So, question though, would that not? I'm assuming that wouldn't take effect until the next time we vote on those seats, which would be after this next
Statehood can actually be done at any time. The Congress could take Puerto Rico, Guam, and make it a state. There was a very
I mean the election to decide who's gonna be in there.
Getting the senators, so you wouldn't. I think our argument is you wouldn't. But I would imagine you'd have a special election, because there's no election cycle set.
There's 2 ways you create a state. One is the bill proposes, here is the initial state. The other is that the territory has a convention, votes, establishes stuff, and says, here it is, right? Now, in the case of like Colorado, when Colorado became a state, Colorado was made a state by the Republicans for the purpose of getting Rutherford B. Hayes elected. Rutherford B. Hayes won the Electoral College by 1 electoral vote. And what did the Republicans, even back in 1900s, knew he was in trouble. So they had this territory of Colorado that said, well, let's create this, make Colorado a state. And in order to make Colorado a state, you have to name the interim governor and the Supreme Court and the districts. And then that state said, gee, we don't have time to actually hold a vote for electors. So here are 3 electors who happen to be 3 people who happen to vote for Rutherford B. Hayes. So they if somebody were slightly behind Electoral College and wanted to create a bunch of states to get a bunch of electors in, because remember, the Electoral College says every state has electors based upon the number of senators, which is 2, plus the number of representatives, which is at least 1. So every state you create, you get 3, right? If you went and divided Texas into 5 states, you could get another 12 electors who may be friendly to you or not, depending on how you carve it up.
I wonder how I wonder how constitutional it is that we have this many citizens that are under this strange situation.
It is very constitutional.
Why that hasn't come up?
Because the courts have not said, the courts have said it is not 1 person, 1 vote. They said 1 man, 1 vote, but court said that's not. And you say, well, what do you mean? We're a democracy. No, we're a representative form of government.
Right.
But what do you mean? Well, if you are a citizen of Wyoming, the number of people, the least populous state, number of people per senator and your member of Congress is small. If you're a resident of California, You have a whole bunch of people for your representative, right?
That's why you have the Senate, though, right? Or the House.
Well, yes, also the House as well, right?
Right.
So your number of people you compete for your attention of your representative in a place like California is different than they were originally saying, well, okay, for this many citizens you get a representative Congress, but they realized that would end up being Congress with unwieldy number of people, so they capped the number in Congress because the Constitution lets Congress determine that number. So
interesting.
So I guess what I'm saying is that you can create a state at any time, and the Washington D.C. has already by plebiscite said this is our Constitution and this is how you had the interim governor would be the mayor, the interim legislature would be the city council, right? The people we voted for anyway, because they do allow city council, but the city council has basically no power because Congress is the one that decides how much money they get and whether stuff happens. So bootstrapping the state by either declaring it by legislation or letting them do a convention and propose it is relatively easy. The problem I think comes down to is it's ultimately a partisan and some people say racial matter.
Yeah.
So just to because of the way that those delegates are proportioned, I was trying to find so voting power by state, and then this is calculated by taking let's see, the full Senate voting power plus the full House voting power, and then this is actually including gubernatorial voting power, and that is divided by the total number of citizens. The least powerful state is Georgia with 0.57, and the most powerful is Wyoming with 3.101, which is about 6 times. So in Wyoming, your vote counts 6 times more in terms of how much you can influence the government over if you live in Georgia. California is actually usually reasonably low. I think they're low by the other. Yeah, and California is even lower when it comes to senatorial elections, of course, because you're voting for the entire state is voting for 2. If you're in North Dakota, you're voting with fewer people in the actual pool for the same 2 senators as you are in California with far more. So you do your power fluctuates greatly based on where you live.
Yeah. And if the 25th Amendment threw the election of the president into the House of Representatives, having a DC state, it would give the presumably, if they vote along party lines, the Democrat 1 more vote. I mean, there's another thing so there's a bunch of things that happen, and one can say that these, people say, well, we want to do by the original intent of the founding fathers. We'll say, no, the Constitution is supposed to be a living document. We're supposed to be rational about it. And that's back and forth thing. And there's also the notion of states' rights, federal rights. There are people that say, well, the federal government's important to hold power over the capital. But other people say, yes, but taxation without representation is a affront to the founding principles of the nation. So as you see, I'm trying to say it's complex. Now, personally, I believe that BC should be a state.
Yeah.
I would support that and support legislation getting it through and support using an opportunity to cause that to come, because I think it's long overdue. But I try to give you both sides of the.
Yeah. I find it interesting though that there's a pattern more recently of like racist issues or like racist sentiment being tied to states' rights and arguments for states' rights for that reason. And it's just kind of interesting that like this is kind of turned on its head where you have an interest of minority rights tied to states' rights.
I mean, the whole states' rights issue
find that
over
interesting.
question of slavery and property
Yeah,
has been around for a while.
yeah,
And I think it's also fair, Courtney. I don't want to impugn that anyone who is against DC statehood is a racist. That is wrong.
right, right.
There are people that are concerned about federal supremacy. They're concerned about undue state influence. They're concerned about constitutionality. Those are important. And so I want to respect those that say no on grounds, because you can oppose DC statehood. I disagree with them without being a racist. I think that's a bad thing if we try to.
Right. No, but I just find it interesting that like the sentiment of the Republican Party is about, smaller government and larger liberties given to the states and things like that. As far as I understand it, one of the major like motivations of the Republican Party, or at least conservatism, is that.
Yeah.
And so I just find it interesting that like in this one case, just because it's politically going to give them less power, all of a sudden they're just going to turn it on its head and say, oh, well, never mind about states' rights. We don't care about it anymore.
I understand that prior to the 60s and things like the Civil Rights Act, prior to the Dixiecrats leaving the Democratic Party and flocking to Republicans, it was the Democratic Party back in the time of people like Lincoln that opposed attempts to try to make DC a state. And when the racists moved from the segregationists, the racists, the people like Strom Thurmond, whose best act on this planet was to die. That's one of his most honorable things he did, was to die, right? That Thurmond switched from Democrat to Republican. It became the Republicans that say, no, right? So it's whatever party that doesn't think they're going to get advantage over this additional state uses arguments that may or may not be germane to the thing. They may not like to say what they say, but that's, it really comes down to, when you had, back in the days of, the Cold War, one of the things that the propagandists of communist propagandists in both, let's say, in Soviet Union would be to point at the horrible conditions inside the capital. They didn't have to make stuff up. They would go and look at the horrible conditions and the fact that these people essentially are subjected to the whim of this legislature without any ability to control it. And they hammered us on that sort of thing. I think quite so, because I think it's a national embarrassment. How you fix it is a disagreement amongst scholars, although I think most of them would think that if you had a proposal to keep the capital district as the district under the constitutional clause and make the majority of what is now DC, the District of Columbia, Douglas Commonwealth, the state of Washington, Douglas Commonwealth, be a own state, you could do that constitutionally, right? They think that would pass constitutional muster.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let me start wrapping this up. Landon, thank you very much for coming to discuss this with us. It is a very interesting issue, and I think it's not well understood. And let's also remember that the DC area has more rights than 5 other territories that are in roughly similar situations to Washington, D.C. Includes American Samoa, I believe it's the U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and Guam, and I think I'm missing at least one. All of them are territories. Everyone born there is an American citizen, but they are not. In
they can be drafted. They have to pay taxes, but
But
no seat at the table.
In most cases, DC did finally get. DC is in a better position only because DC did finally get their 3 electoral college delegates, but that was a special act, and the other the Marianas Islands. That's right. Thank you, Tony. So
Wait, so they I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. The DC got their own
electoral college delegates.
So So that's why when you run for president, you file in 50 states and DC.
Mm.
And when you file in DC, you say, if I win, these are the 3 electors I'd like you to appoint. And so then DC says, electors, your candidate won. Who do you want to vote for president, vice president? And they cast a vote. We'll have a future segment on how you become president.
Mm.
Because
Cool.
I guarantee most people probably don't know, and if they understood, they'd
For
say,
sure.
what the
What the actual? Well, and not only that, we need one on the filibuster too, because that's one that is, I think, very, very misunderstood and has been. And whether or not it should go back to the original, you actually have to stand there and do the whole filibuster. You can just say, "I call filibuster," and just walk away.
Yeah, and so as I say, it is a partisan thing, and the 2016 Republican Party platform advocates DC remaining a district, and they've opposed that because of the partisan nature of the citizens of Washington, D.C. I think that historically allowing people to be represented with having been taxed without representation is a shame on the United States. And I think the old things of like, well, we have to keep one state becoming too powerful is gone, particularly now that the federal government has established supremacy through 13, 14, 15 minutes. So I think it's time, but it's unlikely to happen soon. And here's why: even if Trump is not reelected, and the Democrats gain majority in the Senate, all it would take is a couple of, if take one Democratic or Republican senator to filibuster. One senator could filibuster. Yep. And unless you had 60 votes, you ain't going to pass. Right? You don't need a McConnell. You could just. So that'll be another thing.
Yeah, we'll cover the filibuster.
You're right. The filibuster is important.
The filibuster is going to be
crazy.
Well, and it was different when people actually had to stand there and talk the entire time, and they would talk for 48 hours straight. But that's at least
they did that.
But that's
in Austin.
Brock said time is there, but it's going to be very difficult to get it passed at this stage.
Yep.
And hopefully at some point it'll happen. But welcome to the United States.
Well, thank you. Thank you all very much. Thank you to everyone who's in the live chat. Thank you for switching rooms, and sorry about that brief disconnection. I will be in the Discord in about 5 minutes in the after room live chat. Anyone who wants to join me there, I think Landon's going to be there too.
I will be there as well. Switch over.
So
I'll see if I can figure out how to do it. I might come too.
Definitely, please join us. Tomorrow I will be on ProLib's channel. We will be discussing Star Trek. He's going to be starting a new series on Star Trek, and if I recall, I think we're actually going to be talking about psychology of Star Trek, also some of the founding principles Gene Roddenberry had in doing it, including his atheism and why there was no ships. There is a ship's counselor, but no ships. What is it? Priest or minister. So we'll discuss those things tomorrow on ProLib's channel. Then the day after that, Christopher Mowdy will be back here to discuss for a 2-part segment on Thursday and Friday the 3 recent studies that have found a high correlation between how likely you are to get COVID and what shows on Fox News you Courtney's good at that exactly. That's going to be an interesting.
I'm so excited
to that one. So that's an unusual time. That is 2 p.m. Eastern, 1 Central on Thursday and Friday. We hope you guys will join us.
It's going to make sense why Texas has had like the biggest spike.
Oh, well, there's a lot of reasons, Texas. Yeah. And then I think I wanted to do a news update today, but we are having technical issues like crazy. So that may be, we may have to push that off. Also, we will be having Landon on. And so our continuing series a week from this Thursday, Landon will be back to discuss I think it's the Supreme Court, although actually we had on the docket civic duties and responsibilities, but we can push that back. The Supreme Court, especially with the apparent switch of Robertson's to the swing vote, which is interesting. So there's a lot to discuss. We do look forward, and yes, please, if you like the show, if you're enjoying the content, please hit like and subscribe. It does have a significant impact, and we look forward to see you guys in about 5 minutes on the Discord. So thank you all. Thank you, Landon, for coming, as always. And we look forward to seeing you all soon.